dozens of promises for orphans, to come to them, to hear them, to lift them up, to be their father, make them a home, execute true justice on their behalf, maintain their cause, tons of them. But one of the days I realized most profoundly that it's all about him, that he's the only star in the story, is a story about a little 4-year-old boy named Joel, or as we say in Mexico, his name is Joel. I was speaking one August in a local church in the Cincinnati area, and afterwards this man came up to me and he said, "Hey, you said you're from Monterey. I go to Monterey all the time on business. Why don't we exchange business cards, and the next time I'm in the city, I'd love to take you and your husband out to dinner and you can show me your orphanages." And I thought that sounded like a great idea, so he and I exchanged business cards, but we have a bunch of kids, and that day I had a skirt with no pockets on it, and so between holding the kids and not having any pocket, I lost his card. But he didn't lose mine, and 4 months later, he was in the Monterey area, and he gave me a phone call to tell me that he was down at the convention center, and he would be done around 6 o'clock, and he told me where we could meet him, and he said, "I'd like to take you guys out to dinner, and then you could show me around to your children's homes." And I thought that sounded like a great idea. I didn't remember, I had lost his card, so I didn't remember his last name, and I didn't remember what he did for a living, but I definitely remembered his name was Carlos. So when he called, I knew who I was talking to. Well, that same day, unbeknownst to me, one of the children's homes that we served there had run out of money. And the director of that children's home, his name is Edgar, he could have called us. If he had let us know that he had used the last of his pesos to buy what was a brunch-like meal on that Saturday morning, we would have run him over an emergency kit of beans and rice and eggs and oil and tortilla. That's why I live there, to do those kinds of things. But he was getting nervous that the kids in the children's home he serves were beginning to see our organization as the giver of all good gifts, and we know that God is the only one that's the giver of all good gifts. And so he was afraid if he called us and the kids saw us come with that package of those items, that they might get confused on from where their provision comes from. So instead, he spent the day in prayer asking the Lord what he was supposed to do. He had no more money and no more food, and about 45 kids that evening to serve another meal to. And so when it came time for that meal around 5, he called them all down into the dining room, and they didn't smell anything cooking, and there wasn't anything on the table. And he circled them up around the table, and he just said, we're going to pray. We're going to pray that you, as the children of the King Most High, have something for dinner tonight. I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know where it's going to come from, but I know that he loves you. You are his favorite children, and he will answer your prayers. So the kids are kind of like, okay, this is weird, but they closed their eyes and they bowed their heads and they began to pray for dinner that night. And one of those little boys was 4 years old. His name was Joel. And I don't know if you sat in a prayer time with a 4-year-old, but they just don't sit still very well. So just seconds after Edgar began to pray for their dinner, he raised his hand. He was like, "Tio, Tio, 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 Tio," which means uncle. That's what they call him. He's like, "Tio, like, we're praying that God brings us dinner." And Edgar was looking for the teachable moment. So he stopped the prayer and he looked at Joel and he said, "Yeah, we're praying that God brings you dinner." And Joel's like, "What kind of dinner does God bring you?" And Edgar's like, I don't know what kind of dinner he's going to bring you. What kind of dinner do you think he's going to bring you? And Joel thought for a minute, and he's like, "I think if he's God, I think he brings you meat." And Edgar was like, okay, well, let's pray for some meat. So they bowed their heads a little bit longer, and Edgar began to ask God to provide them some meat for dinner. And Joel's like thinking and thinking and thinking and praying, and he raised his hand again. He's like, "Tio, Tio, 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 what kind of meat does God bring you?" And Edgar was like, "You know what? I have no idea. I know he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, but I don't know what kind of meat he's going to bring you." And Joel thought for a minute, and he's like, "I'm thinking if he's God, I bet you he brings you steak." Because this is a boy who's had his share of hot dogs in life. And Edgar was like gulp, like, okay, let's pray for some steak. So they bow their heads and they began to pray for, continue to pray for dinner, and include in that a petition for steak. And no, we don't know any of that's going on. Meanwhile, my friend Carlos calls me back again, and he's like, "Hey, when you guys come down to the convention center, would you bring a pickup truck? Do you have a pickup truck?" And I was like, "Yeah, we have a pickup truck. Why?" And he said, "Well, I got tons of leftover product, and I can't take it back across the border, and it's just been sitting out all day, and people are already starting to throw product like mine out in the dumpster behind the building, and I just keep thinking to myself, you guys could probably use it. Do you want any of it?" and it was time for me to confess that I'd lost his card and I didn't really know what kind of product we were talking about. And he goes, oh, remember, I work for the John Morrell Meat Company. I'm here trying to attract some new restaurant business, so I brought all these cuts of meat down here, and I just keep thinking you might want it. And I said, oh, totally. We've got lots of kids that we serve, and we will always take your meat. Sure, we'd love that. And so my husband went down to the convention center with the pickup truck to pick up Carlos, and the plan was I was going to meet them at the restaurant. Well, he calls me after maybe a half an hour, and he's like, honey, I've got so many boxes in the back of the pickup truck that I got like those tie-down straps over the back of it. This is all we have at home is like a little deep freezer. He's like, this is not going to fit in the deep freezer tonight. There's so much in the back of the truck. We're going to need to start dropping it off directly at the orphanages right now. So will you call ahead and let them all know that we're on our way? And I said, of course. And so the first place that we called was Edgar's Children's Home. He's right downtown in the central area. And so I call Edgar, and I'm like, hey, this is Beth, just calling to make sure you're around tonight. Todd's on his way over with a donation. And he's like, oh, yeah, we're around tonight. Do you know what he's bringing over? And I said, I don't know what he's bringing over. I'm not with him. He just wanted me to make sure you're around. And he's like, really? You don't have any of the details? And I said, okay, well, I know you want me to make sure you have room in your freezer. You got any room in your freezer tonight? And he said, I got some room in my freezer. Do you know what he's bringing? And I was just like, I love him. He's one of our dear friends, but I was feeling a little exasperated because we're like in the orphan business. Anything fits in your freezer usually is a pretty good idea. But I said, you know what? I don't know. But he's like, would you mind if just calling and finding out what you're bringing over? And so I was like, sure. So I hang up the phone with Edgar and I call my husband back. I'm like, honey, he wants to know like what exactly you're bringing over. I don't know when we got so picky, but just can you give me a lowdown on what you have in the boxes? And he said, well, it's unbelievable. Like, he was trying to attract some restaurant business in our great big city of 8 million people. So it's like the most incredible cuts of like filet mignon and sirloin and T-bone and New York strip. And it's like, I don't even know if they're going to know how to prepare it, but I certainly think it's like we're going there for dinner tomorrow night. It's pretty incredible. So I call Edgar back. I'm like, hey, I don't know if you got room in your freezer, but it's like T-bone and sirloin and filet mignon and New York strip and like these incredible cuts of steak. So you got room in your freezer for that? And that's when he told me what had been going on in his home that afternoon. And then he holds the phone away from his ear and he yells out to the kids, hey kids, God's on his way over with your steak. And I love that story for two reasons. One is I think God has big plans in mind for that 4-year-old little boy, that at that young, tender age, God taught him that it takes faith the size of a mustard seed to move a mountain. You don't almost get a faith smaller than a 4-year-old orphan. Like, that's about the smallest size you can come up with. And he taught that little boy and all the rest of us that hear his story that he set up the system from the very beginning, so it's not ever dependent on what we bring to the table. It's wholly dependent on the promises that he has made on his end. And the second reason I like that story is because it's a reminder to me to allow myself to get my back pushed against the wall. That sometimes when I feel myself come up against the wall the way Edgar purposely put himself there, that my first tendency is to call out to man. But when you call out to man, you get things like beans and rice and oil and eggs and tortilla, which feels really filling, but the truth is it's pretty cheap. And there's something otherworldly about calling out to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords and watching him provide on his promises.